I have always wanted to do that song, but I've never figured out when would be a good time to do it. And then I read Ecclesiastes. And I thought, I think that's the same guy. Speaks to that ennui, that sort of reality that we find ourselves, a bittersweet symphony, that reality of life that is, now I can't remember who said it, but life is a pain, you work, you live, and then you die. And it's that existential sort of bleakness. And there's certainly, you can be overwhelmed by that. You can certainly experience that in life. There's no question about that. And it's been a question that's been a part of our humanity since the time of Ecclesiastes, when he was writing it down. And prior to that, it's been a part of our humanity ever since. So we began discussing this series about 5 weeks ago, I think. And we're wrapping it up today. I'm wrapping it up this morning. And I want to think with you, just kind of go back over some of the basics. First of all, we talked about this idea of what it means to live as if in a what-if world. Well, the what-if world, of course, is Ecclesiastes. The what-if world is also the folks that were around Jesus at his time worrying about what they'll wear, what they'll eat, what they'll do, how we'll survive, how we'll get through. Will the kingdom ever come? Will it be what we expect? I mean, it's the same reality, the same thing that we live with as we think about will our kids be what we expect they'll be? Will our job be what we expect it to be? Will my relationship be what I expect it to be? We have all of these what-ifs. It's just a fact of who we are. And so I started exploring this idea at the time after Easter Sunday, because I called it, and what I'm calling it is what it means to live resurrected life. The as if in a what if world. Do you like that? Hopefully you can see some of that. And what I talked about is this idea that it's what renews us, is living a life, a new life, renewed life, that God's yes to life. How do we participate in that? How do we experience that as if it is here? And I brought up this idea, the image of a cocoon, that the cocoon is kind of spirituality for most of us. And it's a developmental process. I think maybe some of you went through, I think it was in the Methodist church years ago, they used to call the middle school period of time, they called it chrysalis. I don't know if you remember, some of you who might have been Methodist, maybe you had something similar to that. This idea that this is the time of formation, this is the time you form your faith. Well, we find ourselves in this cocoon most of our lives at one point or another, that place where we form spiritually, but a lot of us never get out of the cocoon. Speaking generally, a lot of us never actually leave the cocoon. We're sort of stuck in there because, in all honesty, the cocoon is kind of comfortable, right? There's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of worry out there. There's a lot of anxiety trying to figure out who I am in relation to everyone else. It's kind of easy sometimes to stay in that cocoon, even when we retreat, when we backstep, when we regress. It's still sometimes more familiar. So the cocoon is a struggle for us. And it should be, because that's what happens in a cocoon. But what I suggested was that there's these, and I like Sharm's word that she used last week. She used this word preoccupation. I spoke of dualities or a continuum, sort of. But it is a preoccupation that we find ourselves with in the world. There are four major ones that I mentioned. This idea of success and failure was the first one we looked at. And then the second one that we looked at was fame and shame. And all of these, you'll see, they relate in many ways. But they're preoccupations we find ourselves with in our life. And no less so in the time of Ecclesiastes. If you're reading the first chapters of Ecclesiastes, you see the same kinds of questions that they were struggling with then, certainly in different contexts, but the same kind of realities. And then we talked about praise and blame, Sharm spoke about last week. And this idea that we, the fame, of course, this idea that we have some significance, that we have some importance, and of course the shame that we live with, that we never never really mounted to anything, that we could have been the contender, but we really never got there, so we go back and forth and back and forth. Each one of these, you can see how we just go back and forth in trying to navigate these preoccupations. And I suspect any one of us in here can identify with some aspect along these. If not now, certainly there was a time in our life, or we certainly know someone. Today, we're speaking of this last one, pleasure and pain. And this one, I think, perhaps is the most telling, and I'll speak to that in a minute of why it is. But this reality is that we find ourselves caught in these preoccupations. I don't know if any of you ever read the book Zorba the Greek by Nikos Kazantzakis, who I studied a lot in seminary, actually. My professor, homiletics professor, was a scholar of Nikos Kazantzakis, and so we read all of his books. And Zorba, this wonderful story about Zorba, who's this fellow that sort of lives in the midst of life's ups and downs, the midst of life and celebration, the midst of death, and all these images are throughout the book. But he's working with this journalist who comes to live on the island of Crete with him. And at one point, his boss, he calls him boss says to Zorba, you know, have you ever been married? Because the boss is dealing with his relationship problems while he's on this island. But he asks Zorba, have you ever been married? And Zorba says, married? Well, yes, of course I've been married. The whole thing, wife, kids, debt, family, the full catastrophe. And when you see that, I mean, you hear that and you think, that's sort of the cliche, perhaps, on even an older traditional sort of notion, you know, being bogged down with family life. But the reality is that all of life is a full catastrophe, right? I passed somebody in the hall of one of the folks that I had been with for years when I was doing youth ministry here, who's now got family and kids and very active in the church. And so she was asking me about the granddaughter and, of course, our son and his girlfriend. And I was asking her about her son, and he's now in high school. And then she looks at me and she says, it never ends, does it? And I said, well, no. And then she said, but we love it, don't we? And I said, well, sometimes. But that's the whole point, right? It's the navigating this reality. How do we navigate this reality? If we didn't have kids, it's no less stressful. It's no less pleasurable. If we have kids, it's no less. If we have a job or not a job, we decide that it is. We look at it that way. We interpret it that way because we're still stuck here, right? We're still preoccupied. So we're out of work for an hour. We're a terrible failure. We feel shame. We blame ourselves. We're in pain. You know, so we go back and forth. How do we navigate this wider sense of what I call resurrected life, or what I believe is what Jesus is saying when he says we are living in the midst of the kingdom now? What does it mean to experience that? I was at a school about 3 months ago, and at the library, the librarian was there, and we're getting towards I guess it was last year actually, because we were towards the end of the school year. And this first grader comes in, and he's got a note from his mom in the library. We're on a break, and he's got this almost tearful face. And he looks up at the librarian, and he says, we can't find the book. And the librarian says, well, you know what that means? And then he starts to almost cry and says, we're going to have to buy a new one. And she says, well, I'm sorry that's true, but welcome to the real world. And he just kind of looks at her and doesn't know what he's talking about and walks off a little bit sad, because now he's going to have to go back and tell his mom that they're going to have to pay. And I'm thinking, that's going to be the story of your life for the rest of your life, right? You're going to have debt. You're not going to have debt. You're going to be in debt. You're going to get out of debt. That's the real world. It's the full catastrophe. So early on, we find this ability to try to get out of our cocoon kind of stunted. But the challenge, I think, and the opportunity is to move through this. And how do we move through this? Yesterday, yesterday, I think, my wife, Linda, told me this story, and it was really an interesting illustration of what's going on, I think, for us. She was at a world market, and I don't remember which one here in the city, but she was at a world market, and they had changed the line system to how do you get to the cash register. So it wasn't necessarily obvious, she said, but she was clearly standing there waiting for a minute while one of the cashiers was working, and then there was another clerk who was doing something else at an empty cashier, but working, obviously. And a fella and his wife pulled up next to Linda with a pretty full cart filled with stuff. And Linda had just one item, some napkins, and I think maybe some plates that were matching for this week. And so she was standing there, and she smiled at the couple, and the couple looked at her, and the fellow said, "Well, do you have any idea who's first here?" And she said, "Well, I think this is the line, but if you're in a hurry," and at that point, the clerk who wasn't doing anything said, "Sir, I can be with you in just a second." At which point the fellow said, "Well, I don't know why. We've been waiting for someone to help us ever since we got here. We stood back in the wine section, and nobody's been back there to help out. And I've been looking all over." And then the clerk said again, "Well, sir, I'm finishing this up, and I'll help you go back there." "Well, it's too late now. I don't really see any point in it now." And at that point, the other register opens up, and Linda's not sure whether to go or whether to stand there and offer it. And finally, the guy looks at his wife, and she says, "Well, this has been the most miserable experience." And they leave the cart and walk out the door. And the fellows, of course, they're looking at each other. The clerks are looking at each other, wondering, like, what could we have done any different to have helped the situation? We have this sense, I think, when we get caught up in here, of living with a sense of entitlement. And sometimes that entitlement is bold and brazen, to where the rest of us are like, really? You know, we see it on the highway, we'll see it in our day-to-day living. But then it's also subtle. It's also very subtle in the sense in which we realize we think pain shouldn't happen to us. When we think problems shouldn't happen to us. When we think disease shouldn't happen to us. When our narratives stop going the way we think they should be going, we feel like that shouldn't happen. There's a sense of entitlement that we all sort of have that's very subtle. But again, it's caught up in here. And one of the things that Richard Rohr talked about in one of his books, The Divine Dance, which I think is a wonderful book, which is about the Trinity, but I think it's so much more, is he talks about the pathways in which we sometimes are broken open. And he says, typically, there are two. One is awe or wonder, and the other is through suffering. And both of these paths open us up to a reality because they challenge this assumption of entitlement. They challenge this assumption that things should go a certain way. The problem is that we don't always navigate through them. A lot of times what we do when we experience suffering, when we experience things not going our way, is we fall back into one of these places. We fall back into one side of these preoccupations. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the most interesting, I think, is very simple, and it's called dopamine. I'm just going to bring it right down to biology. Our neurobiology craves dopamine. It's the pleasure. It's the pleasure neurochemical. And our body produces it in different ways, and in other ways represses it. And in certain patterns that we find ourselves in, we end up repressing it more and more. And then we find ourselves trying to go to extremes to get it back. And we call those addictions, right? We fall into these patterns. And we failed to navigate through this, but what we found ourselves now is in such a pattern that we have buried ourselves deep into the cocoon, and it's harder and harder to get out. When Matthew's gospel says in the text here, it says, "Therefore do not worry, what will we eat, what will we drink, or what will we wear? But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness." I think what Matthew is saying, what Jesus is saying here, is that at the heart of our being, at the heart of our reality, is what the Apostle Paul called the ground of our being, God. That when we seek that when we seek God, so to speak, that when we seek to be connected, we are opening up the possibilities of moving past all of this. It's interesting that all the traditions of religion speak to this. If you look at Buddhism, and you happen to know what the first noble truth is, do you know what it is? Oh, you're all Buddhists in here. We have a few. Life is suffering, right? You know what the second one is? Just out of curiosity, anybody? What's suffering? Fear? Well, fear is the consequence of it, yeah. But suffering is attachment. Okay? Basically what Jesus is saying, your need to increase your height, your need, in this text, your need for what you wear, your need for the clothing, your need for how you eat, your need for this, your need for that. Attachment. We're buried in attachment, right? We're surrounded by attachment all the time. Our reality is based on attachment. Every advertisement we watch is an invitation to get attached, right? Or to a concept of it that's based in attachment. And the consequence is that if we don't get that, then what do we feel? We feel fear. We're afraid. And there's all sorts of things that threaten that attachment. Everything from our relationship because we're not really grounded, or in our kids because we're not really rooted in something bigger, or in our job again because we're not really grounded, or in our world because it's threatened by people who want to take. There's a great story that happened on Invisibilia. Did anybody hear it yesterday? Anybody listen to Invisibilia? Yeah, a few people. It's a great podcast. So I'll tell you the quick version of this story, and we'll wrap it up. But in this story, there's a family that's invited a bunch of the neighbors over, and they're having a party in their backyard. And it's kind of an open backyard, and it's a nice neighborhood, and they're having this wonderful party when all of a sudden a fella comes into the middle of the party, and as this couple is talking to each other, he steps over to this one couple that's narrating the story and says that this guy pulls out a gun and points it right at him, and then points it to his wife's head and says, "Give me your money now." And they're stunned at first, and then their second immediate reaction is to think about giving him their money. But the problem is nobody brought a purse or wallet. Nobody has any money. And they plead with the guy saying, "We don't have any money. We really don't. If we could give you a credit card." He says, "I want your money, and I need it now." And he keeps kind of pointing this gun, and they keep saying, "We don't have any money." And then it starts to get out of control as people are actually anxiously trying to convince him, not just this couple, but others, we don't have money. And it looks like he's about to lose it, because he's come into a situation that's untenable. It's not what he predicted, right? He predicted, I go in with a gun, I get money, I leave, everything's cool. But now his reality has been shut down, at which point the young woman has enough presence of mind to do something completely unrealistic. And she says, "We have wine." She gives him this wonderful invitational and tone suggestion and says, "Would you sit down with us to a glass of wine?" And it stuns him. So she doesn't stop there. She keeps saying, "I know that you wanted to have money, and I wish we could give you our money, but we do have wine, and we're having a party, and we're celebrating, and we'd love for you to be included. Would you sit down with us?" And he's lowering the gun, and as she continues to invite, and nobody's threatening to overtake or take the gun away, he puts the gun in his pocket, and he sits down and has a glass of wine. And then they're talking. And this is what's happened in this story. She's telling this event. She said after about an hour, they'd been talking, they'd been drinking wine. At one point, the guy takes another sip of the wine and says, "This is really good wine." And they talk about where the wine came from. And at one point, the guy finally gets up with a glass of wine, and he says, "I'm taking this glass." And they all smile, and they say, "You should. Take the glass." And as he leaves, they're all sitting, they go back into the house, and they're just kind of in this stunned sort of reality as they're trying to process it. And the guy apparently left the house, walked down the front yard, and about a house down the sidewalk had finished the wine and set the glass down in the middle of the sidewalk. And they found it there later on. It's interesting to me how we approach life and this whole reality of pain and pleasure, that we sometimes approach it from a sense of protectiveness, right? From a sense of fear or anxiety. We approach this whole thing. But what Richard Rohr says is that life is actually, when you work through suffering, when you work through awe, when you find these moments that challenge our conceptions of the way things are, but then you stay with them. You don't run back. You don't retreat. You stay with it. You say, "I wonder what's here now." and you open to it. You risk that vulnerability. That when that happens, you begin to open up to something, which I call the resurrected life, but he also calls it love. What Teilhard de Chardin said, the mystic said, that the universe is not driven by gravity, it's driven by love. And Richard Rohr says that everything in life, when you finally get down to it, is relational. What does it mean to seek the kingdom of heaven? I'm going to invite the band to come on up here because I'm realizing we need to finish it up here. So I'm going to make a couple of this final points here, and you guys go ahead and get situated. But what does it mean then to seek the kingdom of heaven? And all these other things will be added. Are we talking about manifest destiny? The secret? That if we envision it hard enough, if we put it out to the universe is going to give it back? I think that's true about 30% of the time. So maybe that's a policy that you ascribe to. I don't think that's what this text is saying. I don't think this text is saying that. I think this text is saying when you seek the kingdom of God, what you seek is to be grounded relationally, is to find ways to be connected, is to open up to connection as opposed to defensiveness or preoccupation with what we need or what we're afraid of. And it's vulnerable, and it requires taking a risk sometimes. But it's perhaps the most profound way in which we can live life fully and begin to navigate these preoccupations, not with possession, not with ambition, but simply propelled by love, that longing to find connection. And that when we do that, the cocoon begins to open up, and we begin to find ways that life is much larger than ourselves. Amen.